Hello, we are live, and just got back from just got out of a data science meetup. Of course, talking about cryptocurrency and blockchain again, and the day at the statehouse, talking about how to create enabling legislation in Vermont to open the door to blockchain and digital currency startups. So today we have been talking quite a bit about different ways that the state could utilize cryptocurrencies or blockchain technologies. And we've been talking a lot about healthcare, talking about the economy in general, education, open educational resources. And we are exploring all the ways to educate Vermont residents. Healthcare, talking about education. So let's see if we have any of our collaborators in here yet. We've got Mark. Mark, awesome. Hey, let me see. Let me get this invite over. All right, Mark, come on in. Awesome. I don't know if Steven's going to make it on today. I didn't get a confirmation from him. And, the Bitcoin market's still a little depressed. So, he might be sleeping off his depression from the price today. But we'll see if he pops on here. It was floating around 10,000 all day. It's still in consolidation mode. The whole market's been kind of sitting around, not super exciting. But we're still we're at a 60-day low. So it's not like we're experiencing the Great Depression or anything. But yeah, hanging around 10,000, not a whole lot going on there. But we will get there. So hey, Mark, how's it going? Oh, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm doing well. How are you doing, Ryan?
Good. So we had a lot of good chats today about open educational resources and cryptocurrency for the state of Vermont. What do you think was the most exciting thing that we went over today?
Oh gosh, we went over a lot. So I think it was quite fun to do the interview on the Orca. That was quite a lot of fun. Also, meeting with some of the representatives, I think that was quite exciting because we met with the Vermont Progressive Party director today, and I think it's really quite a lot of fun to be promoting these technologies in Vermont because the state politicians are a little bit more accessible than in other states, and it was a very positive feeling overall, I think.
Yeah, I have to say I've been pretty excited and really surprised pleasantly, and it's been a good response from the legislators I've spoken with, from the State House in general. We've got a good vibe in Vermont, and I feel like it really is the right kind of fertile ground for progress and for the development of these technologies, and especially open technologies specifically. I think that it's the kind of idea that Vermonters are craving. We're all about social impact. We're all about more than just the single bottom line, and I think it really does open the door for Vermonters to see a path forward. It's very hard to see how to make a business work when you're looking for the triple bottom line, and how do you make that sustainable. And I think the token economics capacities really allow us to see the long-term view of how a project can survive, how a resource can survive by creating this ecosystem around it.
I think today I decided based on conversations with people promoting blockchain, it looks like there could be interest in a bill promoting open educational resources. And so if Vermont was, in front of both blockchain, cryptocurrency, it could be in front of open educational resources as well. And so I'm going to start looking into that and speaking with representatives about that issue as we go forward on blockchain too.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great way to start to cross some of the sectors, right? Because I think that's the piece that we're trying to get across, is that this is not its own thing, right? This is a tool, this is a technology that really influences across sectors, cuts out middlemen, disrupts the industry incumbents, and in many cases really offers the future for industry incumbents, right? Because there's a lot of businesses, including banks today, that are in many ways struggling to maintain viability, relevance. And these technologies can be the avenue that reinvigorate them, that give them the pivot to remain relevant. I talk a lot about my own bank and how I'd like them to be able to service my cryptocurrency needs, but even more importantly, from being able to refer my mother to a bank that can service her cryptocurrency needs, because she does not have the technical capacity that I do, and she still should have access to these assets. So, there should be a service provider in her vicinity that fits her paradigm that can serve those needs.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Did you? I think cut out there for a second.
Oh yeah, that all sounds very reasonable. So it's going to be interesting to see the footage from today's interview as it gets cut, and I'm really quite excited about how things are progressing. Quite excited, very excited.
Absolutely. I see a comment here, and I responded to it, but I want to say it live here. The conversation about the transaction tax component does come up with almost every one of these conversations, and universally, the folks involved in this conversation, we all agree that needs to not be in there at all. The state can revisit that later. They can, tax an established technology in the future, but there's no point in taxing an emergent technology that is a disincentive to progress. However, the tax being in that bill, I think, was potentially a wise strategic move, just to plant the idea that the idea of taxation can be embedded in these systems, because I think that's a common objection is, oh, well, how are we going to collect tax, or that kind of thing. And really, these systems make it easier to collect tax, right? You just build it in the code. But that may need to be demonstrated. So having that initially in the bill to say, oh, let's scrap that for now, we can revisit it later, opens the door and preempts the objection of, oh, what if we can't tax it? So they know it can be taxed. They know they can build it right into the system. We don't need to worry about that right now. Right now, we need to get companies and startups to do business here, come here. We need to, let the companies that are here already know that this is a place to do business and explore this technology. And from there, we can figure out if we need to tax it later, or if there's other social impact benefits or public good benefits that justify remaining untaxed.
Well, what would I? I that does seem to come up a lot, that most people are against the tax. The different ways in which value can be produced from these technologies, it seems to be varied enough and unsettled enough to let it develop, and then, just as you're saying, figure out later how to, cooperate with the state if necessary. If I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and to be fair, if we create an organization, starts out tax exempt, and it turns out that it's facilitating real estate transactions, right? And our property taxes pay for our schools in Vermont. So if the real estate blockchain decides to incorporate something that facilitates materials and education to local school systems, do we need to still tax the same way, right? And so these systems may introduce new solutions to how to tax or how to allocate value to serve the people, right? To provide education, right? Because the purpose of taxing is to take money from one sector to pay for education. But if the sector is facilitating the education, then is it fair to then tax it to pay for the education? That may not make sense anymore. So we might have to rethink our implementation of tax principles for the sort of new paradigms that are presented by these economic and token systems.
I can think of a really clear example. That's a good example, and I can think of perhaps an even simpler, maybe not simpler, but another example as well that really muddies the water in terms of how should taxes work. Let's imagine, we talked about this today during the interview, mana.
Yeah.
So is it manabase.org? Is that what the website is?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me see. Mana.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
actually, you know what? I've got a link for it.
manabase.com. Yeah, I think it's manabase.com.
And that's Grant Coin. If anybody's looking up on CoinMarketCap, it's still listed as Grant Coin on there, but they're rebranding as Mana Coin.
Yeah, so that's universal basic income plus blockchain. And so this is a cryptocurrency that basically it's slightly inflationary. It introduces 3% mana every year, but it decides to enter those, to distribute those coins to everyone participating in the blockchain. One person, each person gets an equivalent amount of mana. Well, let's imagine that really takes off. Stores begin accepting mana, and let's say it's working well in Vermont. That might be far-fetched. That might be a fair amount of time from now. But you've got to ask yourself, if that's operating, do you really want to tax that? Because really what, it would essentially, if that was really functioning and mana was being used all over the place and had value, it really essentially replaces a lot of the social services models that the state currently operates through taxes.
Right.
So that would be a really clear example. I think it's a stretch at the moment to imagine how mana is going to accrue value, but it isn't impossible or inconceivable. So that really does challenge. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't thought these issues through entirely.
Well, to that point, so if somebody has a bond and they own it, not inside of an IRA or anything like that, they own a bond, that return on that bond is taxable, right? So that's not really different, right? So if you have, mana and the, wallet holders receive a bond, they purchase a bond when there's a market fluctuation that warrants it, then when they receive payouts from that bond, those would be taxable, no different than anything else. Now, you could argue that the participation in this network is for the public good, and you could say it should be exempt from those taxes. But it doesn't really change its taxability. Like, the fact that it's cryptocurrency doesn't make it harder or easier to tax. Now, we start talking about anonymized cryptocurrencies and private coins, those may be harder to tax, but we're not talking about implementing a private coin in Vermont necessarily. And even if we did, it still doesn't mean you can't write into the code, a taxability component to be able to pull a portion of a transaction to pay tax with. But again, you come back to, if the system is doing what it's supposed to do we need to pay tax out of it, or is that a double taxation? Is the system not already serving a public good in lieu of paying tax?
Yes,
and so
exactly.
if we actually have Yeah, I mean, and I think that, another thing that we talked about today was just, an idea of supplementing public service, right? So you have, a way to additionally tokenize people's contributions. So they may get a salary, a teacher may get a salary, a social worker may get a salary, but we look for other ways to verify their contributions to society in that type of work. Or volunteer work. It doesn't have to be a social worker. It could be volunteers doing this as well. But their activity verified that they, fed a meal to a homeless person or spent time in proximity to, people in need, could reward them with a coin or a token. And that, based on even philanthropic value, could add value to what they've earned. The question is, they've already received a salary for the work they do, and that's been taxed, and now they're just getting rewarded in tokens. Well, that reward in tokens, should that be taxed because they're just getting an added bonus to what they're doing? Well, again, you could argue that, yeah, maybe it should be just the way a tip is supposed to be reported and taxed, even though it typically isn't. Most people don't report their tips, but they're supposed to. So you could say, yeah, they should pay tax based on the fact that that's kind of like a tip. But then you could make the argument that, well, they're being rewarded in a system whose sole mission is to reward people for performing a public good and contributing to, some kind of civic engagement. And so, should that really be taxable, or is that participation the public benefit, and so should not be taxed because it's already essentially the effort itself was a tax and an effort for the public good? So there's a lot of conversations that I think get introduced there, and the only solution is really to explore them. We need some pretty deep thinkers and philosophers to actually institute some of these solutions, and then, of course, we need to observe the results and try to evolve and adapt these solutions to serve our needs.
Yep, and then grow the ones that are really working.
Right. And that's why we can't say like Vermont has to do a Vermont coin. Like maybe they could do it, but if they do it, they have to do it in a way that sort of opens it up for a playing field where, there could be a private entity that literally copies and pastes the same software and is doing the same thing from a different angle. Or Vermont as a state can open it up and say, hey, we want some entities to create these kinds of services. We'd be happy to see 1 or 2 or 3 that offer this to our residents. But that's the kind of service that, we would, consider, tax exemption and, sort of some benefits, these enabling laws to help them do business here, help them get a foothold, help them educate the residents, and help the residents take advantage of the benefits of this technology. I'm hoping that will, get across to them, and they'll be able to sort of take us forward in that.
So what's the process now for the bill? I was following that a little bit. So it needs to be. It's in the process of being revised a little bit. People are it's out there, and now people are thinking about the various provisions. What's the next step with that? Do you
well, that's a little bit. So that's a great question, probably for someone other than me, because I'm just learning the political process here. But I do know that having gone through the 2 committees, at this point, we are, I believe, waiting for it to be added to the agenda in the next committee. My indication from Paul was that it should get there, and that we're, I believe the intention is to edit the draft before taking it to that next step. So then they can come to it and say, hey, let's keep this thing going. We've trimmed it all out. We've got it really just pared down to this really simple thing. We think this will be the right step for right now. Be ready for more steps to come. And that we can take out some of the stuff that's really just sparking more questions, which is good, but we want it simple. We want them to pass something. That's the most important thing right now, is for something to pass now in this session, and preferably sooner than later, and not wait till next year to get something meaningful happening, because by then it literally will be too late. So I think that there is a session coming up, or a committee meeting coming up that it could get onto. I want to say someone mentioned Ways and Means, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And I'm going to try to get Ben on here if he's available, because I know he can speak to the political process a little better than I can. And let's see. But I know Ben and CJ and Paul are keeping tabs with Vermont. CJ and Paul are with Vermont Futures, and so they are keeping tabs fairly well on where this is in various senators' minds, and kind of keeping it in front of them. So yeah, the next step, I'm really not sure what we're doing in the State House, but I do know that we are compiling these recordings, and we're hoping to get this video from Orca on. Hey, Ben.
Hey, I don't know if my video is on here.
It's on. It's a little fuzzy, but I see you there.
Yeah, I'm kind of, we're in bedtime
right.
mode.
Yeah, kids going to bed.
Grown-ups.
So with the recording we just did today, and some other people were working on Friday, and there's a little bit more video going into that. We're going to pull some audio from the State House, and hopefully we can get that that half-hour video put together. That we'll do a good job of putting a face and helping put some understanding about this technology to the public. And that's something that we can all help with too. Once we have that video, I'll share it on here. I'll share it on Facebook and whatnot, and we can spread the word about that and get people watching that. Because if we get enough hits on that, then we'll be able to do another one, and we'll get another half hour out there, and we can start to really approach this from an educational standpoint of getting it out to the Vermont residents to start to recognize why this is important, how to evaluate the language that's coming at them from all different directions, and hopefully get their support on encouraging our legislators to pass this and other future bills to enable this kind of business. So yeah, Ben, we were discussing the question of the next steps in the process. And so there has been both a Senate committee and a House committee meeting discussing SB269, where they have taken testimony primarily from Oliver Goodenough, but as well from a number of us and some other parties. And I know that we are trying to trim that bill down a little bit more before it moves further through the process. But maybe you can share some insight as to really kind of what this looks like. I know that March 1st was floated among us as a possible goal to actually getting this moved. So what can you tell me about that process?
So I think the first deadline to be aware of is what they call crossover.
Okay.
And that's where bills have to be in play by that date in order to have a shot at passing this legislative session.
Okay.
So that's generally the first real hard deadline in terms of moving the bill through the committees. Okay. And as you mentioned, you've got to have a bill in both chambers. So it sounds like we've got two different bills, one in each chamber.
No, actually, so I may have stated that wrong. So there was a Senate committee that looked at and took testimony on SB269. And then I believe it was a separate House committee. I could be wrong on this, but I believe it was a House committee that was taking the second testimony on the bill. But I don't know if that meant the House was taking it up, or if it just happened to be a committee that was hearing on the bill and going forward from there. But that was Charlie.
So it was what?
I believe Charlie was one of the senators in there who was crossing over between committees. Yeah, I'll check my business cards later.
Yeah. So generally it's either a bill from one chamber goes through the other chamber as well, or they create a native bill in that chamber. So for instance, it's Senate Bill 269. So either there'll be in a House bill, so H, whatever number it's assigned, or the House will actually take up S269.
Okay.
So depending on that, process, it can either work in parallel, or it has to kind of complete the process in one chamber before it goes over to the other chamber. But either way, the bill is going to have to make the rounds in both chambers. They kind of decide on the fly, and this is from my understanding, they decide on the fly in these committees which other committees are going to need to address the bill.
Gotcha.
And of course, each committee has a particular area of interest. And then depending on how the bill is amended, so which kind of components it covers, whether it's economic or it tries to spend money or it deals with any criminal justice stuff, it's going to have to go to the appropriate committee depending on what it's attempting to do.
Gotcha. Okay.
And
I think Ways and Means is the one that hasn't been to yet, but I think that keeps coming up as potentially the next committee that we're kind of hoping or expecting that to get forwarded to. And it's been through, I believe, Commerce was the second one that we sat through that was a little bigger. That I thought that was a House committee, but I may be misphrasing that. And then the first one, I forget what that committee was, but it was a much smaller one, and it's the one that had Allison Clarkson and Becca Balint on the committee, as well as I believe some private non-public figures were there on the committee as well, maybe from the banking industry.
So the non-legislators would not be a part of the actual committee.
Okay.
So it could be potentially a working group if it's a combination. Yeah, if it's a combination of legislators and non-legislators. Okay. Then it's not a formal committee.
Okay, or is it a commission? Do they call it?
Right. So the semantic. So it could be a commission or a working group or a study group.
Okay.
Right. So that would be different than the actual committees in the chambers.
Okay.
So because I haven't been at the State House, I'm not exactly sure where the legislation is. I mean, you could theoretically go to the legislative website right now and type in S269 and see which committee it's in, which committee it's been in. Mm-hmm. And so this is interesting. So this is one thing my platform is actually looking at doing, is breaking down the legislative process into almost a game board format.
Okay.
Because it's got this very rules-oriented process.
Yeah.
But there are a variety of paths any legislation could take, depending on what we just discussed, how whatever the legislation tries to do, it's going to have to go to the related committees. If the legislation is very simple, it doesn't try to spend any money, doesn't try to do anything substantial, maybe it only goes to one or two committees.
Right.
If it's a bill that involves taxes and money and it's going to affect the general fund and all these other things, then it'll have to be more extensively vetted by more committees.
Gotcha.
And all this has to happen before crossover so that the bill can be in play for the second half of this session.
Okay.
And this is what happens is the committees sometimes start digging into a piece of legislation and then they say, hey, this is actually fairly complicated because it's trying to do X, Y, Z. And then they have to make a determination based on the other legislation in play. Hey, do we have time to really address this in a thorough manner?
Gotcha.
So you can either change the scope of the legislation and move it forward, or sometimes if they don't have enough time to get it done, they'll put it on the wall, so to speak. And that's the goal as advocates, is to keep things moving forward.
Right.
So trying to get those committee members to say, okay, well, if there are any questions, what are the questions? How can we answer those for you? So that you can make a determination to pass this bill on to the next committee.
Okay.
And then after it gets through the committee process in both chambers, they have to essentially resolve any differences between the House version and the Senate version. So if there are no differences, like literally no commas, periods, words different at all, then it can just move forward. If there are any differences, it has to go through what they call reconciliation.
Okay.
And it can bounce back and forth between the House and the Senate a little bit. If they still can't reach a consensus on the language, it goes to the Committee of Committees, who's a member, I think it's 6 or 7 legislators, and they make a determination on what the final language will be. And I'm pretty confident in this process, but I may be
sure.
A little bit incorrect, but I'm pretty sure.
Well,
that's
a lot of clarity. That has a lot more clarity than we had 5 minutes ago, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's kind of a chutes and ladders type zigzag process, and it's really interesting because there are no definitive rules on which bills move forward and which don't.
Right.
And this is where your lobbying efforts and your advocacy efforts make all the difference. So if legislators kind of get a fire lit under their butt by constituents who are paying attention to this issue, that holds a lot of water in terms of whether they're going to move it forward or not.
Right. Gotcha.
Because they're busy. They're essentially overwhelmed and underpaid.
Right.
And that's why the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Gotcha.
Yep.
All right. Huh.
Yep.
So, hey, just thought of this. So your platform, when you click on a Senate bill, does it pull up the actual document into your web page, or does it go to the website?
Currently, it does not.
Okay.
So currently what we're doing is we're linking to the external website of either the Vermont legislative website,
yeah,
or another website that tracks state legislation, called openstates.org.
Gotcha. Cool.
Openstates.org is a great resource as well.
Awesome. So I'm curious, would it be possible, or maybe this would be the next evolution, because right now, as it stands, right, SB269, you can find it in your platform, and you can click it, you can say for or against, and you can call, leave a voicemail, but that's sort of like an inappropriate thing at this point in the process, right? Like that wouldn't really be an appropriate thing. Like it'd kind of be irrelevant, yes or no, because it's not going to get passed in its current position anyways. It's not at the phase of yes or no, right?
Sure. So and the idea would be, is it a yes or no in its current language?
So what if you could have the constituent pull a PDF of the bill and then highlight in yeses and nos, right? Highlight this section, yes, I like this. Highlight this section, no, don't like this. Highlight this section, yes, like this. And then maybe highlight this section, maybe not sure about it, or here's my suggestion for rewording, and crowdsource the writing of legislation.
Yeah, so I mean, basically there are multiple tools out there that do this.
Okay.
It's just really, really complicated to do that at any sort of scale at all in a meaningful way.
Gotcha.
So you end up, it ends up forking these arguments at a multitude of places.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, the legislators just don't have the capacity to manage that type of process. They would have to spend time going through each person's highlighted arguments and saying, oh, I agree with this or don't agree with this.
Well, so the platform would need to filter that, right? So the platform, it could pass that data, and whether they want to access or not is up to them to move the process forward. But the platform could say, hey, here's some things that have popped up. It won't say who did them, but then you could have people essentially like on Reddit, like upvoting or downvoting certain edits to the document, 100%. And the platform narrow it to here's this version that we found like a 30% consensus on. Here's this version that we found a 42% consensus on. And that kind of information could be useful once distilled.
100%. So there's kind of multiple organizations working on this problem. There is software that was written probably 5 years ago called Madison.
Okay.
Like James Madison.
Yeah.
And Madison, that was the whole point of Madison, is to crowdsource legislation and do exactly what you're talking about. Take a piece of legislation and start making comments on specific components of the argument. So there's just multiple things at play. It's how many people can you get to comment on the document? So is it really reflective of public opinion?
Sure. Right.
And then again, it comes back to who's managing this process. And then besides that, that's just to figure out exactly what you're going to present to the legislators. And then there's the other side of the fence. Once you throw it over the fence to them, do they have the capacity to even look at it in that context?
Right. So now we need a Vermont. Now we need a Vermont coin that's going to automatically issue an initial coin to Vermont residents. All they have to do is verify residency and download the Vermont coin wallet, right? This is all in the future, non-existent yet for the audience.
Sure.
But then you have the platform to deliver polling, right? So now you can have your platform that maybe consolidates some interested parties process in the documentation. But then, as we talked about, some polling techniques for saying, on a scale of 1 to 10 or in a range of this and this, and you get different kinds of opinions, you can be delivering those things directly into people's wallet platforms. They could ignore them if they want to, but they'd have the option of maybe getting some kind of extra incentive point for participating in giving their feedback and polling against these different pieces of legislative change. And your platform could centralize it so that it still doesn't overburden the state, It would bring that data back through, consolidated into something that can be provided as a report to the state.
Sure.
Meanwhile, you've tokenized and incentivized people to continue to pay attention,
Sure.
to be aware of those notifications coming through and participate.
And this would be basically the role of an advocacy organization. So it would be kind of that centralized effort that could go out and grab those bits and pieces of public feedback,
right?
Contextualize them, clean them up, put them in a format that can then be presented to a legislator in a way that the legislator can actually consume that data and make sense out of it. So there's a great tool for polling that we've looked at implementing inside of our software called Polis, POL.is. So that's a great polling mechanism because you essentially just make a statement and then you ask participants to either agree, disagree, or pass.
Right.
And then what that does is that it avoids the kind of tangled,
the back and forth
of someone commenting on someone else's comment, and it spins off into this thread.
Right.
And that information becomes kind of obscure and hard to leverage. So this keeps everything in a standardized format so that you could ask 1,000 Vermonters, do you agree with charging a tax on Bitcoin transactions?
Right.
And they would either agree, disagree, or pass. And then you could take that data to a legislator and say, hey, we asked 1,000 Vermonters and here was the breakdown of the people that answered. This is how many people agreed with the tax. This is how many people disagreed with the tax. And then you could actually use Polis to dig deeper into the components of the tax. Why don't you like a tax? So
right.
You would have to reword it, not in a question format, but in a statement format.
Right. But you can also do interesting things too. Like you'd be like, hey, should, a coin reward for participation be taxed, and see what the result is. But then you could also ask a similar question, be like, should you be taxed on your airline miles? Right? And see what the results are and start to realize not only where opinions stand, but also find gaps in education and recognize where you need to do work or where a group needs to do work to educate a population.
And this is what's tricky because you can take it a layer deeper and even get into doing A/B testing with the wording of your statements and your questions. So this gets into like public polling, statistical stuff of how you word your question or statement totally matters on the results you're going to get. And that's why, as you can see, the deeper you get into the nuance of public opinion polling and deep kind of boots on the ground community engagement work, it gets super nuanced and super tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to figure out how to distill that information in a way that it becomes meaningful to the legislators who actually have the power to make these decisions.
Right.
I think this idea of the video testimonials, I think is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, to avoid kind of reinventing the wheel, this experiment out of Taiwan of participatory democracy called V-Taiwan, they really dug into a lot of these components and how you use digital organizing as well as kind of traditional boots on the ground door knocking organizing to generate data that has legitimacy, so that when you present it to legislators, you don't have to ask them to value the data, making the assumption they care what constituents think about. They would inherently care about that data. So then it becomes just a matter of generating the data. And that's where you get into digital media production. And is there a website people can go to read about this stuff? Are you capturing email addresses to start to do a weekly update and then ask people for their feedback? So then it gets into traditional digital marketing channels. So it's like a website, a Facebook page, a Twitter account, and some of these technologies. So your technology stack on how you're asking the public questions and how you're tracking that data. So this is, obviously you and I have discussed this stuff, but this is, I think, really exciting because right now the initiative has a lot of energy and there's just not really much structure around it. But I think moving forward, because right now it's like you're in the heat of the battle, it's end of January legislative session. So things are just going to have to be done in parallel, thinking about moving forward into next session and just moving forward. So in terms of getting legislation done this year specifically, I think what you're doing is the right thing. You've got a small group of interested people and you're meeting in the State House, which already separates you from 90% of initiatives out there, because you're putting human bodies in the State House. And that's really how Vermont politics work, for sure, is having human beings that can go in there and meet with the legislators in person. And then to put a little bit of kind of public polling data behind those personal relationships makes the initiative that much stronger in terms of commandeering the time and energy of these legislators. So yeah, I mean, I think you guys are really doing great. And it just shows to me, it speaks to the level of interest of Vermonters in this technology. Because in my experience of 5 years of really being deeply embedded in Montpelier, you don't see initiatives just really kind of pop up out of nowhere and just hit the ground running with the energy. Usually it's kind of a longer term endeavor. You go out and you raise money and you hire an executive director and get some grassroots organizers. But this is an initiative that seems to have taken shape very quickly in a matter of weeks. So I'm optimistic, quite frankly. I think you're doing all the right things. I did see the email that came through requesting communications to Senator Sirotkin. So I think that's interesting because that starts to get into the public call for, speaking up and getting people to speak up. And what that makes me think is I'm starting to rack my brain of like, who are my contacts in Chittenden County who are actually constituents of Senator Sirotkin? And starting to think about what are the levers to pull to influence Senator Sirotkin. Obviously, he ran, the Necrason Group used to be his lobbying firm. So he was a lobbyist for 25 years. I believe his wife actually used to hold that position, and she passed away of cancer a few years ago. And he was appointed in that position. So he left his job as a lobbyist and went right into being a senator, which there was some consternation about several years ago prior to Vermont having any ethics legislation at all. So that didn't violate any sort of, holdover period that normally you'll see between lobbyists and legislators. But so that said, he comes from a lobbying background. So I think he probably values those in-person communications because that's the business he was in. But certainly he's a legislator, and I think the opinions of his constituents is going to impact his perspective as well. So doing kind of a 1-2 combo of pulling him aside in the State House and then also trying to generate, again, when you look at the numbers, if we could get 10 people from his district to contact him, that would, be more than who's contacting him on a lot of the other issues he's dealing with. So that would kind of be my general thoughts in terms of, at this point, from where I understand the bill is at, moving it forward into the next committee to keep the momentum moving forward, would be trying to generate 10 contacts from constituents of Michael Sirotkin. I have two brothers who actually do dabble in cryptocurrency a bit. So I've already contacted them and said, hey, reach out to Senator Sirotkin and just tell him you're an entrepreneur. My one brother is a software developer. He runs a software development firm out of Williston. And there are potential applications of blockchain in his auction software. Feeding him some of these talking points and because I know he's already interested in blockchain in general, and just saying, hey, reach out to your senator because right now there's other people talking to him at the State House. So he's going to hear this from multiple angles and it will make a difference. And that's another thing I would say is when asking folks to contact a legislator, trying to explain to those Vermonters why contacting that legislator right now will make a difference, and letting them know that there's also that inside baseball communication going on, so that people kind of get that safety in numbers type feeling.
Hey, there you go. At what point would you see it making the most sense for us to flip the switch to using new grassroots in order to sort of make the, take the final steps, sort of put the nail in the coffin to seal this thing and get it done?
Sure. I mean, so, maybe that might not be the best course of action for this legislative initiative.
Okay.
It depends. I mean, theoretically, again, you could use New Grassroots right now to get 10 people to contact Michael Sorokin. And, this was something that actually came to my mind when I saw that email come through and this comes back full circle to this question of, is there a website? Is there a group pushing this? But you could put out you could drop 20 or 30 bucks on targeted Facebook advertising.
Yep.
And just come up with a simple little ad that embeds a link to New Grassroots and just drop 20 or 30 bucks on some targeted advertising. Another platform that I would look at for targeted advertising would be Front Porch Forum.
Right.
So between targeted Facebook advertising and targeted Front Porch Forum advertising, where you can target particular zip codes, you could target only Michael Sorokin's district.
Right.
And come up with some sort of copy that says, hey, are you following blockchain? Are you invested in Bitcoin? Do you care that the Vermont legislature is going to pass a bill on Bitcoin or on blockchain? And again, coming up with some sort of verbiage of how you want to grab people's attention, but then giving them a link. So, again, it would be about trying to capture those folks' information, whoever clicked on that ad. So this is where if you had a website, kind of centralizing this initiative, you could have a take action page on that website. And then when you do the targeted Facebook advertising, you could link back to your take action page on your website. So that you can hit people with some talking points. And actually I just made some adjustments to New Grassroots, whereas you can create a campaign in a very similar format as change.org, where your campaign then has its own URL.
Okay.
So that would be another way to approach this, is do the targeted advertising, embed that link directly to that campaign page, where then you're going to have your talking points, any videos that you want people to check out to educate themselves, and all the supporting evidence.
So
with a little place.
I'll have to check out this campaign page. But would it be something that we could build up the campaign page to be the broad initiative of advancing blockchain and distributed ledger technologies and knowledge of such to the Vermont public? And then we can use that sort of landing page to say, hey, this is the legislation we're working on right now. This is the next thing coming that we want to get something proposed for, and sort of move it forward like that and keep that same campaign page basically running as long as we see a need to keep the movement working?
So that would probably, what you're describing would be more the function of the website you start, I think, to create the continuity between legislative sessions.
And then create a new, for each piece of legislation, create a new advocacy page in your platform for that piece. And then it just goes away when we're done with that particular piece of legislation.
Exactly. So what's going to happen is at the end of this legislative session, all the bill numbers are going to reset, because we're in the second year of the biennium of the 2-year session.
Okay.
So all the legislation from the last 2 years becomes invalid. Well, so interestingly, it's actually valid all year till December 31st.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting because technically that legislation is still actionable as well, because legislators can meet after the formal legislative session to take action on legislation.
Okay.
They just don't really do it that often, and they definitely don't want to do it because they go home at the end of the session and whatever. But more and more these days, with the litany of important legislation they have to deal with, being a Vermont legislator, even though you're only compensated for 4 months out of the year, is really becoming more and more of a full-time job year-round, because there's just a ton of important legislation.
Gotcha.
So what theoretically you could do is use the current bill, S269, as a vehicle to generate advocacy efforts around, with the understanding that bill's going to go away on December 31st, and it's going to be reintroduced as a new bill on January, 3rd or 4th of next year when a new session begins.
Gotcha. That's assuming we haven't got it passed, right?
Exactly. Assuming you haven't got it passed. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes. So I think the website becomes kind of that just standard home for all this information that you're talking about. For instance, the video of this particular live stream could be embedded on the web page. So you're starting to centralize, because what you guys are doing is hustling.
Right.
And what you want to do is leverage all that effort you're putting in right now.
Yep.
So really you want to start telling a story. And then you got to have a vehicle to tell that story. That would be a web page.
Right. Gotcha.
Or a Facebook account, or some of these other channels.
Yeah. So I think that's we've been discussing this. So I'm gonna form maybe a separate DBA for now. That's going to be an interchain sort of offspring, and we'll start forming a little bit more organization around that. I'm going to communicate with Government Blockchain Association, decide if I want to really partner with them on this or keep that separate.
Sure.
But that I think is definitely the angle, and I think we can open that up then so that gives an avenue for contributors that might want to put some money behind this too to help facilitate what we're doing.
Exactly. You need a donate now button,
Yeah, exactly.
Something I need as well on my website. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if anybody wants to support me, by all means, go to consulting.interchain interchain.consulting, and you can certainly send me money through the Square page there. And
the other interesting thing is when you start a website and you kind of say, hey, here's our little organization that's got a collaborative effort of a bunch of entrepreneurs in Vermont. Will you donate? Will you sponsor our initiative? So you get someone like, I don't know, Seventh Generation or one of these larger Vermont companies who wants to associate themselves with the innovation of Vermont passing legislation regarding blockchain. And you kind of sell it in that way and put together a little one pager that's like, hey, here's some national press this initiative's gotten.
Yep.
We'd love to get you on board as a sponsor. So over the next 18 to 24 months, we can continue to drive this innovative legislation that maybe even might set a precedent for nationwide legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I gotta move on this. Whoever can work with me on this, gotta move quickly, because I think that is definitely, there's a need for it. There's definitely an interest in it. I'm peppered daily with questions from every end of the spectrum on blockchain technology and Bitcoin and how it all works. And people are starting to recognize that the writing is bold and on the wall. And it really is time to be moving forward with this. So,
it's interesting because I read recently that New York has passed some legislation around blockchain.
Oh. And
I was just looking at the Democracy Earth Foundation, who they're opening up their ICO
the vote
on their token called Vote on February 1st. And down in the disclaimer, it said available for everywhere except New York.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa. So if you pass legislation, but it's not the right legislation, you're going to get boxed out of all the movement.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So I keep saying, and lots of people keep saying, enabling legislation, and that's what I want the audience and anybody watching this later to understand, is that we're working very hard to get the state to pass enabling legislation. So the one that we're working on now opens up further study for educating the state, and also opens up the possibility of entities that protect participants in decentralized systems from liability. And that essentially is all we're trying to do. There's a little bit more verbiage in that bill as it stands now, but I think we want to trim as much of that out as we can to keep it simple. But another sort of step maybe added to this bill, or as a separate bill to come in the future, is to model the Nevada bill that basically prevents onerous restrictions, fines, penalties, or regulation on blockchain technology. So ultimately, the combination of these things do a couple things. One, they give us a framework to fit a decentralized organization into a legally recognized structure to protect the participants. And they open the door to let people know now and in the future that we are not going to change our mind later and come up with something else to restrict or inhibit doing business in this way. And those two things are, I think, essential to opening that door in a way that gives confidence that it will stay open, and ultimately bringing this stuff home to help our neighbors, our Vermonters, our Vermont residents, our children, and even the people that might want to come to Vermont that, maybe they're from somewhere else in the world, maybe they're from somewhere else in the country, but they realize that this is the lifestyle that they want. And now, because Vermont has opened doors to the future, they can make the life that they want and work and do business with companies that are free and happy to do business in Vermont.
I mean, that's exactly what the governor is out there promoting right now.
Right.
Is how we get people to Vermont.
Yep.
Are you still there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Looks like my phone's at 3%, so I'm about to die.
All right. Well, I think.
But yeah, the governor. I mean, just.
Go ahead.
What's that?
I said we're actually running up on 8 o'clock, so we'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. But go ahead, say what you're going to say about the governor.
Well, the last thought is really tapping into the governor's existing massive initiative right now, which is how do we bring people, aka tax dollars, to Vermont. So it's like, well, wow, maybe if we open up this sovereign citizen portal, we start to generate tax dollars, and quite frankly, those folks aren't. They're not burdening our human services, our infrastructure systems. So it's kind of a double win. And I hate to think of it like that, but if we can provide them some reason that becomes interesting to them, then it becomes a win-win, and that's a perfect deal.
Right.
Is when both parties are benefiting.
Yep.
So yeah, that might be an angle to try to tap into that governor's initiative, because anytime you can give a politician a political expediency, they're going to love it. So piggybacking on his existing efforts could be beneficial.
Yeah, I hear that for sure. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you guys both for joining me today, Ben and Mark, and all of those out in the audience. We really appreciate you paying attention and engaging in the learning process and joining us as students of emergent technologies. Feel free to reach out. You should be able to find me, the CoWorks space online. If you have any questions, or if there's any way that you are interested in contributing to the efforts, please let us know. We definitely want to work with you, and we want very much to move this forward so that we can take the next steps and build a stronger, more resilient economy in Vermont. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.